Okay. Laura Chow Reeve, welcome. Welcome to the Cosmic Cheeto Podstack Home Away from Home. I am not at home. I am in a coffee shop with a giant coffee grinder, and I'm very excited to talk to you about your book. And that's what's happening for me today. Thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm so pleased. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you. No, I'm so delighted to have you here. This book is an utter treasure, A Small Apocalypse. So this is your debut short story collection, out from I think it's like Northwestern University Press. Yeah, yeah.
Yep. Hmm.
It's such a lovely, just very like I felt, and I think many readers have felt, other readers have felt as well, intimate glimpse into the kind of just like the day in day out of like like a Southern queer life, and how like one builds how one builds empathy intentionally, um and the difference I think between like the idea, or as it is sometimes the case, the ideology, and the lived, like the lived reality. And I love your collection. So and it's just gay as hell. It's just
Yay.
so there's it's just from every direction. It is very gay. I thought the Kristen Arnett blurb was very accurate. The cover stories that astonish, mesmerize, and amaze in equal measure. And they're set in Florida. So yes, Laura Chow Reeve. Who are you, Laura Chow Reeve? For those who don't know you, I'd like to introduce you. You are the author of this collection, obviously, and you're writing in graphic work. You're also an artist, a visual artist, right?
Yeah. And illustration, a lot of it has been kind of like with nonprofits, but
Okay.
I've been for the past few years doing some more like graphic nonfiction and graphic essays.
Ooh.
Um, yeah, I worked with Mira Jacob, who's a really brilliant novelist and writer, but also graphic artist at my MFA program. And she really kind of helped unlock how I could combine those two things together. So I
Ooh.
currently have like two pieces published, which were really exciting. And it's a lot of work though, so it's not something I'm currently practicing as much as I want to be, but I love
Sure.
that medium. Mhm.
That's yeah, fabulous. I am also a huge fan of the graphic essay. It is kind of a burgeoning medium, and I've read a lot of them, and like The Believer is really good about publishing excellent ones. And yeah, I'm so excited to read more from you in that mode. So yes, your written work, your graphic work can be found in The Offing, Lit Hub, The Rumpus, Catapult, Joyland. Oh, love Joyland. And elsewhere, you are a winner of the Penn Robert J. Dow Short Story Prize. Congratulations, and a Blackburn Fellow at the Randolph College MFA program. You are currently in Richmond, Virginia. And notably, these stories, I know I mentioned this earlier, but they are set in the South. I really, really love Southern fiction. I love Southern queer fiction. It's a huge part of what brought me to this collection. So, yeah, I'm excited to talk more. Um,
Yeah,
Before we dive in, Laura, do you feel good about reading an excerpt from this collection?
I would love to.
Awesome.
I'm gonna read from the beginning of Paper Wasps, which is like midway through the collection or close to the end.
Cool.
Yeah, ready?
Hmm.
Lily crushed the paper wasp body with the sole of her pink tennis shoe, heard the crunch from the impact of the rubber on the glass window. It was the third wasp of the day, one of a dozen from the month alone. She always heard the wasps first, their buzzing louder than a fly, and their bodies bumping against the glass trying to escape. Jenna tried opening the windows for them, opening the doors, but they never flew out. Lily reached for her shoes from the rack near the front door and swung. Her dogs, one medium and one small, would sit still on the couch or the large cushion they shared on the floor. They would stare at her, wait for the swing to be over, for her voice to turn cheery and kind when she'd say, "It's okay." And they would wag their tails and wiggle their bodies over to her. "What does it feel like?" her therapist asked, "when you successfully kill a wasp?" "Satisfying." "How long does that feeling last?" "Until the next wasp." "How does it feel then?" "Maddening." When she knew Jenna wasn't around to hear, Lily would scream. She'd let out a primal yell so loud it echoed in their under-furnished living room. It wasn't just the wasps either, it was the flies too, and the mutant spider crickets invading their basement. Her left eye twitched. She howled in the damp underbelly of their home. I just don't want them in my house, she said. I can feel them crawling on my skin. She demonstrated this to her therapist by walking her middle and pointer finger up her arm like a pair of legs. The soft touch of her fingers on her skin made goosebumps rise to the surface, the thin hairs on her arm popping up. Their house was almost too big for just the two of them, a two-story brick house in a neighborhood of old big houses. Their next door neighbor, their next door neighbors had four cars, each with a God-related vanity plate. Two school teachers who always remembered the names of Lily and Jenna's dogs. The house was warm in the summer, cold in the winter. Vines grew through the glass window panes of the sunroom. Spiders sewed their webs in almost every nook and cranny. They had lived there for 5 years, had filled each room with throw blankets, heavy cedar trunks, candles, books, branches of driftwood, yet there was still an emptiness that followed Lily from room to room. Every night before she went to sleep, Lily turned all three locks on the front door and then turned the front doorknob 5 times, each time pulling harder to make sure the door was really locked. Lily would then repeat this at the back door, and then the door leading down to the basement, and finally the glass door to the sunroom. She folded the blankets they kept downstairs on the couch, put two pillows on each end, then checked each door one more time, looping around the first floor like a ghost pulled on a string in a haunted house. Sometimes the wasps crawled. Lily would find her small dog in a play bow, her butt in the air and her nose to the ground. Get, she'd say sharply, before grabbing the shoe or just lifting up her foot and stepping down until they were crumpled little paper balls. It was October, just starting to get cold. Lily walked to work, the crunch of the brown leaves on the sidewalk reminding her of the crunch of the dead wasps under her foot, again against the window. She paused. She paused the podcast playing in her ears, reveled in her own percussive music, walking in zigzags to stomp on as many leaves as possible. When she got to her office, Lily powered up her computer. She clicked on the link to watch the confirmation hearing, a boy who was now a man trying to be an even more powerful judge, and the girl, now a woman, whom he had assaulted when they both lived in an affluent suburb. The woman who had become a doctor said she would never, could never forget the way the man, then a boy, had laughed with another boy. What a good time they had had with one another while she panicked, while she tried to fight them off. Lily sat in her office, illuminated only by a small desk lamp in the shape of a pink flamingo, a reminder of the home and friends in Florida they had abandoned, the home they'd shared before the one infested with paper wasps. The morning was gray and dark. No sun shone through the office's window. Because her headphones were in and her eyes were glued to her computer, none of Lily's coworkers waved or stuck their head in her office as they walked past. And I'll stop there.
Ugh, I love it. Ooh, I don't want to shake shake the laptop too much. I love that selection. I mean, from one pink shirt wearing Sagittarian to another.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
I have to say, it's like it's relatability, of course, in both a niche sense, right? Of like we're talking about lesbian domesticity, we're talking about a very notorious Supreme Court confirmation hearing. We're talking about like a very specific time and place, but we're also like, and I think this is the thing I really love about your collection, Laura. Like it does the universal in the particular so well because I really do think that, you know, um, one need not occupy the same set of identity axes, right? That you or I or, whomever occupies, you know, to read this and
Yeah.
feel a sense of like recognition,
Hmm.
and kind of because this is it's it's also about like, and on me, it's also about feeling lonely. It's also about like,
Yeah.
in a relationship or in a space. And I just think it's very lovely in that sense. So
Thank
thank you.
you.
Of course. I want to actually start. This is kind of a like universal in the particular question. Or
Hmm.
it's like jumping off of that. Yeah. So a lot of these stories, I'm thinking of the first story in particular.
Uh-huh.
Of course, with the lizards, the milk snakes, and then this theme, it shows up in Rebecca, it shows up sort of like throughout your collection, but there is so often, almost always, with the exception of one story, there's like a young woman protagonist who's like figuring out her sexuality, realizing like, hey, I'm gay, I'm bi, I'm queer, like whatever's going on for her. There's always sort of a crunchy dude, often white, often a white crunchy dude kind of hovering around and either amiably, not it's not always hostile. It's just this sort of like amiable and clueless and sometimes hostile
Hmm.
assumption of like heterosexuality. Like and it takes me back, to the 19th century when, of course, we have all these like anti-gay laws, anti-sodomy laws. But like,
Hmm.
why would like, well, why would we need anything? Why would we need to legislate what women are doing? I mean, they're just friends and they're hugging. And, the
Yeah.
idea that like lesbianism isn't even happening, right? Because it can't be
Yeah.
conceived of within such a patriarchal framework. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh my gosh, like is the collection is there's kind of like a hetero pessimism here, almost like it's like, oh, compulsory sexuality or sorry, compulsory heterosexuality equals like just these guys just brutal kind of presence, always hovering in the background. But then it made me wonder, like, is there something more there too, right? Because like I'm sure you and I both feel the same way, and the viewers of this podcast feel the way that we feel about compulsory heterosexuality. It is bad. But like, I'm so curious about like why these men are in the stories in the way they are, and like what the what kind of interiority they're like bringing out of your protagonist, and like where that sits with you. Like, where does your lived experience come in? Kind of a big question, but yeah.
It is a good question, and I was delighted to see it, this kind of like looming threat that you kind of called it of the punk boy. I think that's when you were like writing to me, that's how you described it, which I was obsessed with and deeply identify with. Oh my God, that is such a big question. And I also think naming that this collection took me 10 years to write and publish. And so and I think this might come up later in some other questions. So when I'm looking at these stories, they also are very much in a particular time. And when I was, and you've published a collection before, like it's just, it, it's like, it feels like a capsule of my 20s and things that I was really grappling with and thinking about in my 20s. And I published it in my early 30s. And so, yes, the looming punk boy was felt very like a big presence in my 20s, and I think could get into the particulars of like my lived experience and like what is like fiction and what is not fiction, and like how does that kind of sneak its way into a collection like this. And I guess how I think about it now, and maybe how I was thinking about it then, was this kind of this anxiety or fear around a compulsive heterosexuality, but also just like the easiness of it. Like this could, I think in my head, there's this phrase that I was thinking about then and also think about now, like this could be fine. Like this could be fine, And I think that's kind of like what my characters are navigating. Like this could be fine. Like I could do this. And, and especially in Rebecca, where, the protagonist goes to Florida to be with that person, like is making the active choice. Though you then find out that is that really why? It's like questioned and, takes this kind of like queer ghost figure to kind of like shake her out of it a little bit. But yeah, this kind of like reaching for like could I live this way? Like, should I be this way? Should I live this way? Could this just be like what it is? And then kind of like, I guess if you think about Rebecca and milk snakes, there are two these kind of like magical interventions that kind of like make that choice no longer possible anymore, which I think is really interesting. And so yeah, I don't know if I'm fully answering your question. And I would, I would love to read the essay where someone is like talking about hetero pessimism in the terms of my collection. I'd love to read someone else writing about that. It would be so fascinating and interesting. But yeah, I think those are kind of like more where I was and even like in now later, like how I'm reflecting on the stories, if that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely does. And by the way, I also love there's like, I was wondering if Rebecca is a reference to Hitchcock's Rebecca. The like, okay, cool, that's what I assumed. So viewers, if you haven't seen Hitchcock's Rebecca, I mean, incredible, thriller, suspense, Hitchcocky, obviously it's just Hitchcockian film in which the title references a character who's not present.
Hmm.
And you kind of unravel the mystery of her absence. And so, her passing is weird. And I think that what I love so much, you talk about in like these magical interventions, both in Night Snakes and Rebecca, right? And I'm thinking, Rebecca, like, as the sort of like her life is presented in that story as this kind of like queer ideal, right? Of the protagonist is like, oh, I imagine XYZ for Rebecca. I'm just here in the punk boys orbit, and I can't imagine the glorious, and then of course I think it's such a deft move on your part to later on show like, well, like actually here's how it did play out with Rebecca, with Danny, right? With the kind of the complexities of this messy as hell, very lovable queer 20 something friend group. And then in Milk Snakes, right, like, and this is, we don't have to get too into the weeds of this and like gender and materialism and but like Milk Snakes is, it gets at this sense of that, like, comes up with transness, obviously it comes up with sexuality. And it can feel fraught, right? The sense of biodeterminism, right? Like,
Hmm.
like I talk with so many people about this. They're like the pros and cons of born this way, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, and as it applies to really to anything, because on the one hand, oh, here we have a marriage equality. On the other hand, here we have eugenics, and so
Hmm.
of course, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I think Milk Snakes was so interesting because the like her transformation was presented as an inevitability, and it was, of
Yeah.
course it was uncomfortable. So yeah, I'm curious, like, we don't have to like wade too into the weeds on the whole like real life politics, but like with that sort of like magical or surreal metaphor, like, were you trying to kind of get at that sense of like inevitability, like it's uncomfortable but inevitable, or what was that for you?
That's such a good question. And I don't think I've ever actually thought about it exactly in that way. Is it inevitable? Is her transformation inevitable?
uh,
It's such a good question. I don't, yes, I mean like in that story, I think if we're following the logic of the story, it is. And at the same time, it's uncomfortable and it's also complicated by these other kind of cultural and social dynamics. It's
sure.
like complicated by the current relationship she's in and even like how he desires her change and it is physically harming him. And also, she clearly doesn't want like the closeness with him feels bad, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
And then also like this additional layer of desire of like finding like and it
yeah.
and like this sense of like finding home in these kind of like heat lamp queer parties that she starts to go to or they're not called queer parties but like that's what they
But
are.
exactly, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, in West Philadelphia, which is where that story takes place.
yeah.
which I hope everyone can find when you need them. And also this like other person who is similar to her and how she both wants that like forever queer question of do I want to be them? Do I want to be with them? Is it both? So, yeah. I mean, I think those are really, but yeah, this idea of like born this way, is it inevitable? That's like a really interesting question. I think within the logic of the story, yes, but I think the story is really, yeah, that's maybe like not the full focus, though someone could definitely make that argument.
Yeah, I mean, I thought like what I loved about that story, which viewer listener is about a female protagonist who is dating a punk boy, right? And is kind of realizing that she's literally she's turning into like a lizard, like a snake-like lizard creature, and he is has this kind of almost maybe not even almost he has this kind of fetishistic relationship to that transformation, and she's going and seeking out these like lizard parties, so it is like what I love about it, right, is that it is a metaphor for like, or it could be read as a metaphor for that kind of determinism, but it's not like, oh, I endorse this is how it is, this is how the world
Yeah.
works. It's like, let's explore this, and it's kind of like it's like the best. I mean, it made me think of one of my favorite sci-fi writers, Ted Chiang, because he's, oh my God, the guy is just a master of like the thought experiment, right? And like I was like
Hmm.
reading the story, I'm like, this feels like a thought experiment. This feels like, okay, like what if, we could think of, queerness or transness or whatever as totally determined, like just like a foregone conclusion, and one must contend with the biological inevitability of it. And I think the story does a really great job of kind of like pointing up like, what are the like, are there inconsistencies in that view? What are they? Like what would this mean if it were the actual case? And it was a really cool story.
Yeah. Thank you. And as you're talking, I'm also thinking like what feels important to me is the protagonist is also like, yes, I think the boyfriend's desire can be described as fetishistic. The word is just not going to work for my mouth today. But, and also she's not acting good. Like she's also like
Right.
not this kind of perfect
Yep.
victim character. She's being messy and she's being mean.
Yep.
And and I really wanted that to be purposeful, that like because I do think it's easier that this like the figure of the punk white boy is always aggressor, is always like so villainously bad, and
Uh,
be more messy of that she also is being mean and hard to be with and not fair, and that doesn't make what, yeah. And also I don't know this like he can be soft and kind and also still do things that are also hurtful to her.
yeah.
Right. And so I wanted that messiness in their like interpersonal to be really clear, that she's
Yeah.
not just like this kind of I'm queer and I'm perfect and I've never done anything wrong, because we also know that's like so untrue. And then there is
Contra.
when we were kind of chatting, I remember this part of the story, which is again funny. I wrote these like over a long period of time, so sometimes things are not at the top of my brain, but there is a line about how there are people in this world who also like physically alter their bodies to fit in better with the folks who are like maybe more quote unquote naturally changing. But there are people who like get surgeries to alter their tongues, or like are hanging out at the parties and get tattoos of scales. Like, and there's a line about that they're there and everyone also welcomes them, because who are they to say no to someone who wants to be there? If they want to be there, then they're meant to be there. And so that's also maybe a slight kind of like rupture in this idea of like there's only one way that people are being like other in the story, and that's through biology versus also through choice. So there's also that.
I love that. I thought it was so, I thought it was it's I mean, this is like it is so intensely my area of interest, whatever. I mean, I want to call it my wheelhouse, but I don't know if I can, because it's like there's still so much more to consider about it, and it's hard. One can't feel like an expert. One can't be human and feel like an expert on human desire. right. And even about so that's what. But I love explorations of it, and like identity, desire, self-determination, biology, the intersection of all of those. This story does a great job. And yeah, I want to like echo your what I think is like such an accurate sentiment about like how tedious this would have been as a story if she was just this perfect queer victim of the horrible, evil white colonial hetero. It's like so tired, and I think that kind of just moralistic passion play is I think people are tired of it. I think it's to kind of gently poke fun of a reference that you're making in here, like it's the Tumblr era, right? And we're adults now, and so I think that what it kind of ties into my next question here actually, because like you this is like this story, or sorry, this collection, the stories in this collection I found them to be such a like vivid portrait of like queer Southern life, right? It is like it's like they're very like deeply felt renderings of place and it's like a certain time too, so like you are sort of like I think you were writing, as you mentioned, you're writing this in your 20s, right? Publishing in your early 30s, and now you're looking back, right, and seeing those the best friend you met on Tumblr, the person you move across the country for because U-hauling and dyke culture and it just like like all these like wonderful, silly, messy, nonsense, chaotic kind of just connections. And I think that like man, you this I think you do such a great job, Laura, of like ensuring that we get to know this friend group without idealizing it. Because I think that like that was one of the big mistakes. Talking about this with more and more writers who come on this show, but one of the big mistakes I think of our like mid or like early to mid 20s was this like this it was an ideological fallacy, right? We thought that like queerness was utopian. And we thought that
Yeah.
if we just sort of passed through the gates, right, that like it would just be healing, you'd be healed. And there's the healing, there it is, I think that like, in particular, I think it's the last story or second to last, where you really get into the messiness of this friend group. Like, yes, this is chosen family, and it doesn't make it like perfectly functional and sane.
Yeah.
And so I really, really want to ask you more about that, right? Like, how did you go about rendering? I know, that a lot of these kind of characters and situations are pulled from your own life, but how did you go about rendering this group and what did that Southern setting kind of have, to kind of teach you? What was the Jacksonville, Florida influence in this book?
Yeah, Florida is in this book. My dog is also being very annoying. Speaking of, I wrote about a small dog, and here she is. Um, just really making herself present. Um, Florida is so important to the collection because I think Florida is really important to me as a writer. So, if we're going to dive into like, again, lived experience, I was a dyke who moved across the country to be with my partner now of over a decade, and moved to Florida to be with them after being long distance for a year. Also, very much like yearning and swooning and early 20, like that's it. And when I was in Florida, I had never felt more inspired by a place in writing before. And I think part of it was I grew up outside of LA. I lived in Philly for undergrad, but growing up in California, you kind of like have this like, oh, who else would want to live anywhere type of vibe. Of course, as a teenager, I was like, get me the hell out of here. But there's a sense of superiority. And then, of course, everywhere around the country has that sense of superiority to Florida, right? Like Florida is the state we're all allowed to shit on. And then I visited there and then I moved there and I was blown away by its, I mean, natural beauty, which I hope is really present in the collection and I think is. And also like the queer people who are there and who are from there are are just so special. And I think so often erased because we only want to talk about, you know, like the racist, straight white people who have a lot of power there, and especially like in like kind of the sense of like its governance. But yeah, that there are so many like radical, like powerful people who are fighting really hard to live there and fighting for not just themselves individually, but for each other. And yeah, so I could like get all wax poetic and be really romantic about them. And, I think I found I fell in love with my partner. I fell in love with a group of people who were their close friends, who became my people. And I I don't think I had ever read anything about where you can like about this kind of chosen family that is just that is messy and hard and so um but like there for each other. And before we recorded, we I was talking about like I think living in Jacksonville, Florida, which is like a big city, but is like a small southern place where there is not like a lot of like, and we could go into the differences between being queer and being LGBT, right? But who are queer in like these like other senses of the word. But you really learn how to be accountable to each other and accountable for your actions and how you move, because you can't just move to another part of the city and find another group of people who are gonna, you know what I mean? Like this is who we have, and like so we're gonna as long even when we hurt each other, there's a I think a little bit more of an impulse to like try and figure it out without leaving anyone behind. And I think and none of that's done perfectly. So even though when I'm talking about this, I can think of tons of examples where that was done really hard and messy and awful, but like also it's where I learned how to do that best. And and in the collection, I it's so funny because it started with Rebecca, and then I just couldn't let go of Danny as a character. And then I wanted to kind of build them out together. I wanted you to see Rebecca alive, and I wanted you to also see the big hole that she left in this group of people, and not just from the perspective of this kind of visitor who is like the protagonist of Rebecca. And so, yeah, they just kind of like came when I just like couldn't get them out of my head. And these stories, in the way that short stories can, like, are just kind of like interconnected and touching each other, but you get different perspectives from each one. And then you get kind of the echoes of each one. And then on a craft level, Rebecca is probably the most explicitly magical or weird or surrealist. And the others are like probably more realist stories, but like you have to understand that we're in the world in which Rebecca is happening. So there has to be also these like echoes of ghostness in all of them too. Um, so yeah, I don't, again, I think I like went on a tangent, but um yeah, it would be easy again to make them to idealize them and romanticize them. And I think we would do it's a disservice to that if it's possible to do that. And I think their grief for Rebecca and their like uh desire to stay together is just like so much more believable when they're messy. Um and I will say the only thing that I feel like I really wanted in terms of like ensuring some sort of like happiness and like some sort of ending that felt even like sweet was for Danny. And so I did feel like I gave Danny that in their last story. And so I think that was like kind of the only one that I was like, this person has to get that. Um, so yeah.
I'm such a fan of I mean, like who's surprised there? I was just like, oh my God, this is a human being that I would instantly vibe with, and also just kind of be drawn to in this friend group. I think like as a confidant. Danny is Switzerland, right? Danny's gonna Danny is transitioning. There's just a lot going on for them, and I think that the way they're mourning Rebecca struck me as particularly it struck me as particularly poignant because it's just like I think with young people, there's this assumption like that because yes, things do feel kind of like can feel kind of ragingly chaotic because you like when you are young, things are more unstable and there is so often way less capital because we're all just kind of like looking at these barista jobs or yada yada, and I think there's this assumption, particularly in fiction too, that like the the gravity of a really like distressing situation is going to be like it like felt differently if the character is more like young or like kind of in a chaotic situation. And it's like, well, no, the way that they grieve Rebecca, I thought there was like quite a lot. There's so much depth to it, and there's this like quiet depth really that I thought was just really, really well rendered. And I loved seeing these young people just get to be young and also get to have depth. Is I think what I'm trying to get at. The other thing I wanted to add too, my goodness, I know we were talking about this before we started recording, but the like accountability, the small town accountability that there are fewer of us here, is and we do need to just kind of band together is such a real thing. Like when I moved from Chicago to Baton Rouge because I got like a teaching thing in Baton Rouge, and Chicago where there was just like constant like weird little infight. I'm sure have this in LA and Philly too. It's just like man, like this person dated this person. My ex is the ex is the ex is that. Like this kind of just like stuff like don't go to the queer bar, don't go to that, don't go to the game trivia night, and left a very colorful girlfriend. She was had a lot of it was one of those young relationships. And I left that kind of like in dramatic situation for Baton Rouge, where the hub of queer social life was Trader Joe's, and everyone worked there, and we just all went to Trader Joe's, and we hung out in the very the frozen aisle and at the back of the store too. And it was so fascinating because I was like, I had just come from Chicago and I was like, this feels like a breath of fresh air. Like I feel like I'm not
Yeah.
going, like and the accountability you described, I totally felt that. And I kind of was falling in love with small town life as other folks who, of course, were like gay and their whole lives and were just like, I need to get out of Louisiana. I'm going to Chicago. We're bringing our
Yeah.
kids, yeah. And
Yeah.
so it was this really kind of different cultural exchange in that sense where I was like, I just came from this place and I'm feeling relief. And, so I know that
Yeah.
vibe.
And I think that's like in there's a story called Migratory Patterns, which is the last
Mm,
story of this group of friends. And I think any queer person can understand this feeling of it always feels like people are leaving or coming
yeah,
back. And
yeah,
there's always like this kind of like sense that you are either being abandoned or you are abandoning others.
yeah.
And um and this like kind of searching for the right place. And obviously that's happening
Mhm,
even more now when we
mhm.
have places that like, folks are really unsafe and also like, and at the same time, there's people who are unsafe and are still staying there who are unsafe for multiple reasons and staying and it's
Right.
complicated, right? And that as of like this, especially when it's so small and then like every person feels like such a big loss, you know?
Mm,
And I think there's this part in a different story where Danny is kind of like, I wish I could just hold everyone here. I want everyone to just stay. And I've felt,
yeah.
that so deeply, even now in my 30s, where I'm always trying to convince one of my best friends to come live where I live and or like we're all together. And wouldn't it just be nice if we were just all here? And like there's almost for some of us and for me especially, I'm like, I just want to control you all and I want you all to just be here and also that's like impossible. And so I think like yeah, that's
Totally.
also like while folks are grieving Rebecca, who is this like big like they're really shared big loss together, they're also always missing each other. Or like both like
Yeah.
missing each other basically in conflict or they're just like literally missing each other because that person is no longer like lives far away now. So
Yeah. No, I mean, I it kind of like the title of the book, right, being like a small apocalypse, I think does kind of evoke that sense. Not just right, we're not just talking about like, the hurricanes coming to Florida, right? We're not just talking about XYZ legislation, right? Or at least kind of clashing social ideologies or demagoguery happening wherever. We're talking about like the apocalypse of missing someone, grieving someone, which again, that is universal. And I think like it feels so important to me because, yeah, you talk about people being in places where they are unsafe or they are feeling unsafe or, whatever the case may be. Um, and I know we spoke earlier about how there's like, that can also like, it can really mess with your mind because I remember thinking, having a very basic assumption of like, well, the progressivism is in the North and it's regressive in the South. Right? I mean, you said it
Yeah.
outright, right? Like everyone's allowed to dunk on Florida. And, my wife is an Oklahoman and she comes from a pretty under-resourced part of the state, which is already vastly under-resourced. And the dunking on, and I think a lot of the assumptions of, like, oh, there's this XYZ kind of backwater or this or that, like the people of this state, it's red, it's threatening like categorically. I think that that is fueled by some class animosity. I think it would
Oh yeah.
be pretty, yeah, fair to say that. And I think it feels so important to me to make clear, right, that like you like the real threat can sometimes be, I'm not saying there aren't real threats. Of course there are real threats. But like there can be like a like a fear or like what feels like a threat materializing, and that can actually be one's own sense of bias. Like,
Hmm.
like it's like that is like it's like, oh my God, I shouldn't talk to these people. I shouldn't go live in this place. I shouldn't, and that it's to me that I was sort of shown that, when I went down and lived in Baton Rouge, I was like, oh my God, this is nuts. Like I was fed a crock of bull. Like this is have an amazing
Yeah.
like
And
I
I
don't
think it
know.
also goes to this idea of what we are talking about with characters being perfect and like moralistic
Yes.
too. That like this like false sense of I can be perfect and have a perfect politic and never mess up. And I
Yep.
must expect that of myself and also everyone around me.
Yeah.
Um, which is actually so destructive to like actual organizing or actual like coalition building. And that we could go
Yep.
into that like so yeah, and that's just something that like I whenever I'm talking to yeah, like young people and young writers like really being like let's not expect perfect like that we're ever going to find the perfect place or the perfect people and or we're going to ever be the perfect version, but
Hmm.
actually like what would it mean to like uh s- allow us ourselves and each other to be messy and to like
Yes.
figure it out together. And then also like what you're saying with bias, like I in my day job I work with abortion funds, and the abortion funds that are obviously all of them are doing really amazing things, and the ones that are working in banned states in the South are like often the ones who we look to who have really innovative, smart, clear-eyed solutions and ways to like support people. And
Yeah.
when and those are, and also if we're being honest, like those funds are also like are always from the South, or if mostly from the South, and also like led by like Black folks or Black women, and so
Mm.
like yeah, like it's just yeah, the bias is definitely rooted in class and also race, and yeah, and also
Oh,
just like a complete feeling of from like coastal elites or whatever
which I
of
know
like
I like.
superiority.
No, totally. I have often like been like chuckled at myself for using that phrase, like, oh my God, like don't say coastal elite. But like there is a coastal elitism. This poor human just walked into my frame. I don't want to blow it. I'm to like be not consensually in this interview. Yeah, no, but there is like a coastal elitism, right? Where I think it's like there's an assumption that yeah, like there could be nothing worthwhile happening here. There could be
Yeah.
nothing innovative happening here because I remember it was like Bobby Jindal was the whatever the governor of Louisiana, one of these like super intense like neocon verging on alt right guys, and people were like, well, this guy's the governor of the state you live in, so it's categorically bad. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh man, you should meet my entire amazing friend group. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it actually I want to get into the title of the book, as a matter of fact.
Mhm.
And here, I will hold it up again. I love the cover too. I love the stake. I love the title. A Small Apocalypse. I know I mentioned earlier, right? They're all nature of apocalypses, right? That are kind of happening in this book. Can you talk a little bit about like where that title came from for you, and where you see it like manifesting in the collection?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I could say it any better than you already did, where like thinking of like the apocalypse of missing each other, the apocalypse of like of feeling um disconnected or from the people you want to be close to. Or yeah, but so the title is from a story. So there is a story in the collection called A Small Apocalypse, and that story is about um a a hurricane coming to Florida and the protagonist being in this like local movie theater and kind of like
I love
I'm just gonna be here.
just gonna
That
stay
is
here.
that
So
was
good.
based off of a real movie theater called Sunray Cinema in Jacksonville, Florida, that is
Oh
sadly
wow.
closed. So they did open up another location, I think in Tampa, but a beloved movie theater. I have
Yeah.
to say it. It was just like there will never be a better movie experience. But anyways, that's the theater that inspired the story. Though those no events never happened, I promise. Um, and in that story, so this is a part of this character is a part of that friend group, though in her perspective feels like a little out of it because she's been
Mhm.
messy because she had a girlfriend and then they broke up and then she like started dating someone else in the friend group, right? Like really normal messy stuff. And
Yeah.
also that like, you know, she also is missing Rebecca, but also is like, man, was Rebecca mad at me when she died? Like, was
Yeah.
I just like
Yeah.
a friend of a friend to her? And I'm like, this is outsized. So I guess, and she's also, by the way, while all this is happening, she's playing like apocalypse movies in the theaters.
Hmm.
So she's being very funny. She's like definitely losing it a little bit. But um, and I think I chose A Small Apocalypse for that story because it's like because in that story she's like the apocalypse, there's so many of them. It's not just one
Hmm.
apocalypse, there are so many of them, and inside some of them are very small, some of them are so small it's only for her. It's her breakup with her girlfriend, it's that she got fired from this job, it's that, but there's also like it feels like the world is ending in a way because of the hurricane. And also, she
Hmm.
also understands that this hurricane is going to hit, I think, like either Puerto Rico or where she like talks about the path, like it's going to hit other
Hmm.
places who are more at risk than where she is. And yet, so it's like, I don't know, it's like this kind of acknowledgement of we can acknowledge our own small hurts and like world endings while also how, or it's less we can and more a question of how can we hold the small world endings in the big when it feels like the whole world is ending, or for some people it truly is. And like and I one of the graphic essays that I talked about is actually about my dog dying. And it's connected to this to the title of this story, but it talks about like, the day we kind of realized he was dying was also the day that New York was like covered in red. Do you remember those days where it was like red, like the air quality was just so bad and
Yeah.
just the
Like the
sky was red?
East Coast fires. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, holding those things at the same time or
Mm.
holding it now when, multiple genocides are literally happening, and also like we're living our lives and we have these small moments of heartbreak or big moments of
Yeah.
heartbreak. And I think how do we hold those? But I think a lot of us struggle with how we hold those both. And so I think I just like in the naming the collection a small apocalypse, I wanted to also kind of show like this like just kind of range of how worlds feel like they're ending and
Yeah.
how they're all happening at the same time and we feel them all differently. And they even when they're small, they can feel really big. And that doesn't make us bad because they feel big too,
Yeah.
you know?
No, I know it makes me I know because that's what you're talking about, and it makes me like think of how just some of the like smartest, sanest, most lovely, most humane, creative individuals will like dear friends would just be like, oh, I have, say, a book coming out or this or that happening, but why do I even bother with this? Because name XYZ disaster, right? Like name XYZ, like horrific sort of human rights abuse or this or that happened. It makes you think too, like, I mean, obviously, I don't know Sally Rooney personally, but like, I can tell that she's a person with a huge heart. She's brilliant. She has a huge heart, and she just wants to do the right thing, And I think that it's like it makes me think, right, Laura, because I have felt this way too, various times, and I sometimes think about like what would it be like if we had social media during the 16th century or what I mean, or like the 15th, like what would it be like if throughout human history there had been some means for you and me on this landmass to see what was going on in like plague-ridden Europe, right? Or
Yeah.
like what was going on, like my God, we're reading I like reread Candide recently. And I was like, this woman is missing an entire ass cheek, and it's played for laughs, but it's horrifying, right? Because it's like you have brigands roaming the land, in the 18th century, like assaulting folks, and then also like being assaulted, and you have these like kind of like campaigns against like so many different people. And so the Inquisition, I could go on, right? And I think that it makes me think both. It's not that that is like, oh, I'm so soothed, right? But it gives me this sense of bigness where I'm like, oh my God, like human history has been so various and there's been like
Yeah.
so much horror, but there's also been so much joy. That's what your title reminds me of, right? Where it's like
Hmm.
the apocalypse can feel variously big and small. And it doesn't mean that like everything must grind to a halt and I am wrong for caring about my little art, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Like,
think also Franny Choi has a um a poem. Oh my gosh, what is that
oh,
poem
I
called?
know I think I know what you're talking about. And if it's
Uh
the one I'm thinking of, I love
the
it.
world
Yeah.
keeps ending and the world
Yes.
goes on.
Yeah.
And and the first line is before the apocalypse, there was the apocalypse of boats. And like
Yes. Yes.
it's just anyways, the your listeners, viewers should read this poem if they haven't.
I'll
But
link it.
I also think that that poem for me is a little bit of what we're also talking about. The
Mhm.
apocalypses are many. There have been before this apocalypse, there have been others.
Yeah.
And um and I think also what I love about Franny Choi's poetry is that even when she's kind of like naming these things, there's still this like kind of sense of hope, like and like we can if we or if you and I like we can, there's something that can be done. Um, so anyway, just a plug, when you were talking, it was also kind of reminding me of that poem and of that collection. So
Yeah.
another
I love that.
another piece of
Yeah.
media to add to the conversation.
Oh, totally. I'm definitely gonna link that. I've always really loved that poem, and it I think it provides the reader with a much needed sense of perspective, and I hope that I don't know. My hope like whenever my students would come up to me with with questions like this, I should have just whipped out the Fatty Toy poem because I almost wanted to be like, I am not being a Pollyanna when I tell you that if you get your butt in that chair and you start writing, that is the most thing you can do right. And it's not
Mhm.
because you're going to write a manifesto that will start a revolution that'll make everything good. It's because what you add to the conversation is going to be one more step towards less us versus them. Just what you're
Yeah,
describing, right? Towards faction, like, sorry, coalition building and away from factionalism,
yeah,
away from antagonism. Yeah.
yeah.
No, I'm really with you on that. Well, speaking, what a horrible segue on my part. Speaking of antagonism, um, so there's like, I think we could probably both speak to this. A lot of people who subscribe or listen to this could probably speak to this. There's a pressure, right, in the MFA world, the publishing world, I think, to like, um, write identity fiction and to, and this has been much bandied about this conversation. Um, like it's just like write fiction, write what you know, right? That's how it starts. And then it's like write your lived experience because it's what you know best. And then it's like, hey, you are like XYZ marginalized in these ways. That must be so hard for you. Write about how hard that is so I can read it. And then you were kind of escalating into this sort of like fiction of like misery fiction, misery identity fiction, and I've been so reluctant to write that, of course, like even as I am like as we speak now, I'm at work on a novel that deals directly with some of the most difficult aspects of being like who I am in ways that are like I feel are unalterable. And in a world that is not like hegemonically that way. And so I think that again, another thing I really, really loved about this collection, Laura, is that like it's not that it's not that you are like shying away from legitimate social critique, right? We're talking about compulsory heterosexuality. We're talking about in many of these stories, like these kind of this white colonial presence, like assumption being made. And the story about the website, the horrible dating website, where there's these like really, really offensive to good, like immoral matches being made between people by this kind of government entity. Um, I think there's like so much legitimate social critique here. It's so expertly done. And then I also, though, like what I really love is none of these stories, and you said it yourself, the protagonists aren't perfect victims. This is so not a collection about what it is to be this poor victimized queer and the evil big bad world is coming for you. It's so I think it's like it breathes life, I think, into a lot of these political debates that have gone very stale, for me at least. And I'm really wondering if you can kind of talk about your experience with that, writing that, and just like, yeah, the whole rich tapestry.
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I think it's an interesting question in relation to at least my short story collection. I don't know about others, and that where these a lot of these stories were written, some of these are written in 2014, and some of them are written like maybe in like 2020 would maybe be the last few that were written. Like started. Obviously, they're all edited later too, in the publishing process. But so the first story that I ever wrote for this collection was A Thousand Year Old Ghost. And I think that is interesting because it is probably my most obvious, hashtag Asian American. Just as my aunt, I once asked her if she had read that story and she said she had. And the response was a very funny when I asked her what she thought. She was like, very Asian American studies, which was just like such a like like funny read from her that was probably really unintentional. Um, but it is the most like, it talks about immigration, it talks about like loss of culture and memory and intergenerational trauma and and I am not saying those things as like those are all bad things, but it is distinct from the rest of the collection in that is probably one of the only that is doing that, and it was the first. And I think, and I say that because um I in that when I was writing it in 2014, I was still very much grappling with uh how do I be an Asian American writer? And I know we've talked a lot about like me being a queer writer, but that was also a big question, especially, and as being a mixed race person, which just has a lot, the collection has a lot of like kind of conversations around being a mixed race person too, being a mixed race Asian American person, like all of these kind of other layers. And so I think that story, while I still, obviously have a lot of tenderness towards it, I see a lot of myself like trying to like really show my almost worthiness of being considered a part of like this identity because I was also young and like not sure if I belonged in that identity, which I think as I've gotten older, I feel like less concerned, like that's like less of a concern for me individually. And I also say it because that story has probably been the most well received by, the industry, right? So that's the story that won the Penn Prize. That's the
Sure.
story
Interesting.
that's been featured on multiple podcasts. Like that's the story that
Mm.
like McGraw-Hill reached out to my agent recently to put in a curriculum. So it's like,
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
like, and so it's just something I think about and I notice that like this is,
Hmm.
and I get why I see it and I understand why also some readers feel really connected to it. And I think, also as a writer, if I'm being like the most honest and transparent, I'm like, oh God, am I never going to write a story as good as what people think this one is? Or is it like, I don't know. When I read your question, that was like the first kind of like thing that I thought about was like, probably my most like identity fiction story is probably the most celebrated. And I think there are times when people and I will name that the first people who celebrated that story were also like women of color and also Asian women who were the first people that championed me, period. And it was published in Hyphen magazine, which is a really beautiful, amazing Asian American like literary journal. So like it also like felt like it had this home that felt really special, and felt kind of welcoming me as a writer. And the big elites with like lots of gates and lots of gatekeeping were that was also the story that they first kind of like, oh, look at this kind of thing. Um, so I think a lot about that. And I also think, also a lot about, I don't know, I guess I can track the stories as how they were written in time. And I think as I saw myself growing as a writer, I was able to kind of let myself go of some of those like concerns of like being, and I think I actually, when I did, and I think it's kind of that kind of specific being universal, when I got more specific, actually, and less like I'm hitting these tropes or I'm making it very clear, and I just got more specific about what I was seeing or what I was feeling or what I was noticing. Like that's also when even more people were kind of like, yeah, this is gay as hell. Or like this is or other like um folks with maybe shared identities like saw themselves, or also folks who maybe didn't have those exact shared identities, but also marginalized in some type of way, kind of were like, oh, I see, I also can see this and feel this. Um, and I also, last thing, I know I'm like rambling, but like I think I also started to focus a little bit more on like how can the interpersonal, I got just more interested as a writer in the interpersonal and like the kind of like people between people as a way to also still talk about the large structure. Because the story you're talking about, the dating app, I love that story and I love that premise. I love the idea of writing a story about with a kind of what if premise. And I tried to turn that story into a novel and it really fell apart. And I think because it was like the story, or when it became the novel, it was way too moralistic. It was way too much like trying to make an argument, versus like trying to really understand like these characters emotionally and like what they were, right, like, and also like not letting the like quote unquote bad people be like just like really cartoonishly villainous. Um, yeah. So those are all the things I'm thinking about when you ask that question.
No, I love it, and I mean, I'm of course I'm thrilled, right, that the story is like I love that story. You know, the PEN Prize winner, they're like, as your aunt says, the Asian American Studies story, and I also understand, right, like I mean, both like weirdly, like maybe not weirdly, but like as like a former like lit prof, as a writer, I'm like, oh well, you know, of course that right, like that is the story that kind of like yeah, goes through the kind of like the gatekeepers are in order to get. I've seen it with my own work too, right? Where I try less and less to be like the all powerful gatekeepers and the, you know, like little me, you know. I mean, of course, right? It's more complicated than that, and it's friendlier than that, I think. But
Yeah.
yes, there still is plenty of gatekeeping, and it's interesting what you know, if we're talking about like what is kind of like honored or ushered in, what even basically like what goes like viral or maybe kind of get some more circulation, it's so interesting to see kind of the trends like in one's own writing. Like if I were to just look at like a Substack essay, right? Really kind of basic stuff. And um which ones are like whoa really circulated and which ones didn't, and it's fine, right? I'm not like,
Yeah.
oh, I feel so unseen, but it's more it's interesting because as we're having this identity conversation, right, it's like, well, I contain all of this, right? Like you, like Laura Chow Reeve as a writer, contain like, you know, all of these kind of like complexities, and there is totally this feeling of like it's not even that I, the person, am being tokenized. It's that this one aspect of me is gaining a sense of currency or being reduced. And I used to, I think when I was younger and that would happen to me, I'd be like, oh, you know. But now I'm like, oh, like this is just kind of like, it's this sort of weird shorthand and it's how people work and it's not like anything to be annoyed at. It's just like something to just kind of like quietly be like, oh, okay, like this is
Exactly.
just the human brain, you know? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, well, and actually, kind of little follow-up question to what you said, though. Just like I'm curious, as long as we're on the topic, right, of uh, like writing the kind of like Asian American or mixed race story, writing the like gay as hell story, right, writing the story that incorporates sort of the like just the fullness of who you are, right? I noticed, and stop me if this sounds too lit, profy, but like I was like, it's so interesting how when you're talking about like the past and ghosts of the past, right? Of course, notably there is Rebecca, but there's one of the stories I adored in this collection was the story of Arthur. You know, the family. I can't remember the title of that story. The father who
Oh yeah.
what?
It's the three card spread story. So
Yes.
it's in the shape
Yeah.
of a tarot card spread.
Oh my God, probably why I liked him so much too. Yeah, I love that's I remember that now. Yeah, so I love three card spread, and it is very much a story about sort of like once again, you know, like being bicultural, right? Like being first, second generation, like from like an immigrant family, this young man feeling at odds with himself and his family. It is a story about Asian Americanness, but not in the same sense as I think as you know what you've been talking about. And
Yeah.
what was so interesting to me though was the way the motif of ghosts show up, the way
Yeah.
ghosts show up in that story versus the way like the way in which Rebecca is a ghost. And it might be easy to say, okay, well, queerness is the future, you know, and like the ghosts are the past. It's not that simple though. So I'm really curious if you could like talk a little bit about like ghosts and maybe like how those show up in those two different stories or kind of like what was on your mind with this motif.
Yeah. No, that's great. Also, I think when you're talking, I'm just realizing that three card spread was the last story I ever wrote for this collection, and A Thousand Year Old Ghost is the first. And I don't think I ever really drew those connections. That's why it's
Yeah.
so nice to have a
Like
lit
wow.
prof kind of point some of those things out for you because as a writer, sometimes you forget or like that's like just like
Had it.
you're they
Yeah,
exist, the connections. But so it is
yeah,
interesting that those two are very much Asian American stories. They're both about ghosts, but in very different ways and very different approaches, and probably were written close to a decade apart, if not slightly less than a decade. So that's something I'm going to have to like think about. And I love, thank you for pointing that out to me. But ghosts overall, one way that I have described this collection in a shorthand, or if I'm just like talking to someone about it, is that it is a collection of ghost stories, and there are ghosts in every story, so some are more literal than others. And like, so that does feel like a touchstone, and that yeah, definitely not the ghosts are in the past and queerness is in the future, but that uh we are I don't know how this is going to come out, but like we're all haunted by something, just in the way that we're all like we all have apocalypses, but like we're all haunted by some, and in the story they are all haunted by either, yes, sometimes it is Rebecca who is this literal ghost, or sometimes it is in that three-card spread story where you know, there is like this literal ghost that is like inside the body, and like this kind of feeling of like never quite being able to fill that space because the ghost is there. Um, and sometimes there's another story in the collection in which a person is like kind of recovering from the repercussions of like a violent interpersonal relationship, right? And so like but it's like through the slightly humorous, though obviously that topic is not humorous, but idea of like an upstairs neighbor in an apartment that is like very loud and is like keeping you up, and that's like kind of how that ghost is existing. Um, I'm obsessed with ghosts, and I don't, that's never gonna go away. I'm even in the what I'm working on now has ghosts and has a haunted place, and if a book comes out and there's anything about ghosts or anything about haunting, like that's like the quickest way that I'm gonna put it in my cart. You know what I mean? It's
you
like that's
you
what I
heard it
want to
here
read about.
first,
That's
listeners.
what I want to read.
If you
I,
want Laura to buy your book, write a ghost.
I just think that ghosts, like if it's like a literal ghost or a more metaphorical ghost, they can tell us just so much about a person and or us as ourselves, about like the things that linger that even when you don't want them to, is fascinating to me. And I think, we've talked a lot about like larger social, political, historical things, like how those things linger and are ghosts, right? And we have like a lot of ways really smart people talk about that, and also and we also have like the interpersonal ghosts. And so I think that's fascinating. And also that like not all ghosts are bad ghosts, right? Like there's also like that they are comforting, or that they like provide uh like a map, especially like when we are thinking of ancestors, either as like for me as a person of color, but also me as a queer person, and like what that means to feel kind of buoyed by people who existed before me and who linger because also around like my existence as like a person, as like a queer woman of color who's like in the world trying to exist, trying to like write about things.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think I mean I think I would co-sign all of that, and I love in particular the idea of the like the generous ghost, like the loving ghost, right? Like because I think the haunting and the like the strife of the haunting and like the sins of the past, that so often kind of that dominates the concept of the ghost in popular culture. It's just like like there can also be like ghosts that are memories that like you're working through or that are like visiting you benevolently. So I think, and then which are both in your collection. So I think that's like really, yeah, it's really lovely. Um,
Yeah.
I want to ask you the final question I ask everyone, which is, you actually kind of partly answered the first part already, but if you would like to leave us either with a little teaser about what you're currently working on, what we can expect from you, or a little bit of advice, because there are a lot of young writers who read and watch this, or both,
Yeah.
that would be amazing.
Sure. I guess, I mean, based on our conversation, uh, and how I've been feeling a lot lately is purity politics will not serve you or anyone else. So let's like work through that. Let's like not strive for that. Is a thing I'm thinking about a lot for all of us, not just young people. And what I'm working on now, I'm working on a novel. Um, and it is not the novel that I had been working on for a long time, which was a kind of novelization of Real Bodies, but a different novel, and actually, kind of coming publishing this collection and not in this way of like seeing reader response as like that is should drive your artistic pursuit, but just kind of like being in conversation with people and clarified a lot of like what felt really interesting to me about the collection. And we talked, which is this like kind of chosen family element. And so the novel is kind of it's not the same group of people, but uh it is kind of grappling with chosen family at the end of the world, which you know, I don't know. We only write the same book over and over again, I guess. And I'm writing it. It is a very different book, but it is talking a lot about like what we've been talking about today. So we'll see how it goes.
That sounds awesome. I will definitely be putting that in my cart. Laura, thank you so much for coming on, talking about a small apocalypse fantastic collection. Please purchase this. There will be a link to purchase it below this very video. Thank you, Laura, and sending all the good vibes from this random coffee house
Thank you
to
so
Richmond,
much.
Virginia.
Yeah, thank you
Bye.
for having me.
Of course. Bye.